Talk to us about proper plant nutrition to ensure bud density.
Okay. Well, probably a good example or an easy example of, is this a real thing? Go into any grow store, look at any line of nutrients that you see, whether it be organic, non-organic, whatever it is. Look at the bottles. There's always a bloom and there's always a veg. And we've been trained to look at those three numbers, the N, the P, the K, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. So if you look at those bottles, you will see that these numbers do vary between the flower and the veg. One of the main things that you want to kind of cut off when you transition is nitrogen. Nitrogen can kind of promote some like cell elongation. It can make things basically grow a little bit more, where we want to focus more on the bud production, not so much of stretch or size. So yes, nutrients can absolutely do it. Nitrogen being probably one of the main ones, one of the obvious ones. There's also sometimes an increased demand for potassium in flower. That kind of helps things bulk up a little bit. At the same time, I've been guilty of this. I've seen different products in the garden store where, it's like 0 nitrogen, like 50p, 50k. And I'm like, well, that's going to knock it out of the park, right? Balance is so important when it comes to any nutrient program. So you don't want to throw anything out of whack just because it wants more potassium. Don't just feed it a whole bunch of potassium and nothing else. But nutrients wise, those are the two micro or macro nutrients that really can have an effect on your bud density.
It really can. And I have a horror story when it comes to too much nitrogen. Way back then, when I first started, I was using bottled nutrients, the Fox Farm Trio. That's what I started out with.
Me too.
And good lineup. I had some really good results off of it. However, I got overconfident early on. And, I was checking the ppm and pH and all that stuff, and things were good. And then my next grow, I was overconfident. I was like, I don't need to check pH and ppm. I'm just going to read the plant. Well, I overfed early in veg and, actually into flower. And I was still continuing to feed, especially CalMag is another thing, because some CalMags do have nitrogen in it as well. So you need to really be careful with CalMag. A lot of people cut off CalMag for the first 3 weeks of flowering to make sure they're not feeding too much nitrogen in there. So that's one thing. But I was ignorant to the fact that I had nitrogen toxicity. So I had nitrogen toxicity going into flower. And then it was like week 4 or 5, and I was like, what's up with these buds? These are kind of weird looking. What's going on? This isn't natural. This isn't how my other buds looked. Maybe it's the cultivar? Well, no. It was too much nitrogen in flowering, loose, airy buds, just disgusting. And unfortunately, there was no way of rebounding. I was in week 5, week 6 of flower, and it flushed the plant, but it was a lost cause. I spent the last couple weeks, the buds kind of densed up a little bit, but it was still nowhere near as it should be, and the final product was horrible. I ended up it affected the taste too. It definitely affected the taste. It was gross. Okay. And I threw away most of the harvest, unfortunately, because of that. So I'm glad you mentioned nitrogen as far as impacting bud structure and the bud density, because it absolutely can. You need to make sure that going into flower, you don't have an abundance of nitrogen in there. And I'm also glad you mentioned potassium towards the end of flowering, because a lot of people do use that in the final few weeks to bulk up those flowers and dense up those flowers. But another thing, you mentioned don't overdo it, right? So you have to figure out how much should you be adding in towards the end of flowering to make sure you're not overdoing it. If you have an imbalance of nutrients in the medium, for example, too much potassium could lock out some of the other cations, right? Yeah. Calcium, magnesium, so on and so forth. So balance. But certainly if you are a precision grower, you precision feeding throughout the grow, you can tinker with the nutrition in order to try to achieve better bud density.
And you kind of hit on like a, one of the hidden things too. You mentioned the CalMag. And if you look on the back of a lot of your different supplemental bottles, calcium and magnesium being one of them, you'll see like it's either calcium nitrate or calcium sulfite. And yes, that's where sometimes the nitrate is the nitrogen. that is where that can sneak into the program accidentally. Is you're kind of topping it on, and to look at the bottles to see if it already has calcium and magnesium in it as well. So yeah, those were things that I learned hard way. I learned over time. How about that?
This clip is brought to you by AC Infinity. Use discount code MrGrow at 15 to save on any of their products.